The story begins on a crisp morning in Long Beach, California. The sun was just peeking through the coastal clouds, casting long shadows across the city streets. Snoop Dogg sat in his home studio, scrolling through his phone when something caught his eye. It wasn't the usual music videos or memes that made him stop. It was a raw, unfiltered video showing how homeless people were being treated in his hometown. The video showed a homeless man, probably in his 60s, being woken up from his makeshift shelter. What struck Snoop wasn't just what was happening, but the memories it brought back. He remembered the days before fame, walking these same streets, seeing similar scenes play out. Back then, he didn't have the power to do anything about it. But now things were different. Snoop put down his phone and walked to his window, looking out at the neighborhood he never left behind despite his success. The contrast was stark. His comfortable home on one side, and just a few blocks away, people struggling to survive. The rapper, known for his laid-back style, felt anything but relaxed at that moment. He called his manager, who was surprised to hear him so early in the morning. "Yo, I got an idea," Snoop said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of calm and determination. "We need to do something different, something real." His manager listened as Snoop laid out his plan. A social experiment that would shine a light on how law enforcement interacts with the homeless community. As the day went on, Snoop's idea grew bigger. He wasn't interested in making just another viral video or grabbing headlines. He wanted to create real change. He remembered his own run-ins with law enforcement in his younger days, but he also knew good cops who genuinely wanted to help their community. This wasn't about pointing fingers, it was about building bridges. By afternoon, his studio had transformed into a planning headquarters. His team brought in experts, social workers who spent their lives helping the homeless, community leaders who knew the streets better than anyone, and even a former police officer who now worked as a community relations consultant. They'd all sat around Snoop's mixing board, which had become an impromptu conference table. The plan they crafted was bold but meaningful. Snoop would undergo a complete transformation, becoming unrecognizable even to his closest friends. He would spend time on the streets, not just for a few minutes of footage, but long enough to really understand what people went through. His security team thought he was crazy. His PR team thought it was risky. But Snoop? He just knew it was right. As evening approached, Snoop got a call from his cousin who worked with homeless youth. She told him about a teenager who had just found housing after 3 years on the streets. That's what it's all about, Snoop thought. Real stories, real people, real change. The meeting wrapped up late into the night. Papers were scattered everywhere, location scouting reports, safety protocols, and communication plans. But more importantly, there was a sense of purpose in the room. This wasn't just another celebrity stunt. This was about using his platform to show the humanity in everyone, both those wearing badges and those living on the streets. Before heading to bed, Snoop took one last look at the video that started it all. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of becoming someone else entirely. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but then again, nothing worth doing ever was. As he shut down his phone, he smiled, thinking about how his mama always told him to use his blessings to help others. This was his chance to do just that. The first phase of the plan would start at sunrise. Makeup artists would begin their work, turning one of hip-hop's most recognizable faces into someone that could walk down the street without turning a single head. But more than the physical transformation, Snoop knew the real change would have to come from within. He needed to let go of everything that made him Snoop Dogg and become someone society often chose not to see. The transformation began in a quiet studio behind Snoop's mansion, far from curious eyes. The room looked more like a movie set than a part of someone's home, with bright lights and mirrors covering every wall. A team of Hollywood's finest makeup artists and costume designers had arrived before dawn, their equipment cases filled with everything needed to turn one of rap's most iconic figures into someone entirely different. "This might take a while," said the lead makeup artist, studying Snoop's distinctive features. His experienced hands had transformed celebrities for countless movies, but this was different. This wasn't about creating a character for entertainment, it was about disappearing completely into reality. The process started with Snoop's most recognizable features. His signature braids were carefully tucked away under a specially made wig that had been aged and weathered to look like it had seen months of street life. The makeup artist worked meticulously, using special effects techniques to add years of hardship to Snoop's face. Wrinkles appeared where there were none before, and subtle coloring created the look of someone who'd spent years under the sun. As the transformation continued, Snoop sat quietly, watching in the mirror as his familiar face slowly disappeared. The team added supple prosthetics to change the shape of his nose and cheeks. They even created custom-made teeth covers that would completely change his smile. Every detail mattered, even the smallest thing could give him away. The costume designer had spent weeks preparing the perfect outfit. Not just any random collection of old clothes would do. Each piece told a story, carefully selected and aged to look authentic. A worn military jacket suggested a veteran's past. Layers of clothing, common among those living on the streets, were carefully arranged to both disguise Snoop's tall frame and look natural. Even his hands needed work. Years of music videos and photo shoots had kept them too well maintained. The makeup team added subtle details, roughened skin, slightly darkened nails, the kind of wear that comes from living without regular access to basic care. They even created calluses that matched someone who carried their belongings everywhere. But the physical changes were just the beginning. Snoop worked with a movement coach who helped him develop a completely different way of walking. His characteristic swagger had to go. Instead, they practiced a slight limp and a hunched posture that made him appear shorter and older. Hours were spent getting it right, the way he would sit, how he would reach for things, even how he would make eye contact with people. The team brought in voice coaches too. Snoop's voice was almost as recognizable as his face. They worked on techniques to change his pitch and rhythm, adding a slight roughness that would come from sleeping outdoors. He practiced speaking in a way that was completely different from both his music and his natural way of talking. Throughout the day, they did test runs. Different members of his team would walk past him, trying to spot anything that might give him away. Each time they found something, the makeup team would make adjustments. By late afternoon, even people who had worked with Snoop for years had trouble recognizing him when they entered the room. The final touch was adding the subtle details that most people wouldn't notice but made the whole thing believable. The makeup team created signs of old injuries that had healed poorly, the kind of marks that tell the story of a hard life. His hands were aged to match his face, and even his posture was adjusted to suggest years of sleeping in uncomfortable places. As the day drew to a close, Snoop stood looking in the mirror. The person staring back at him wasn't just a disguise, it was a complete transformation. He practiced his new voice one more time, telling a brief story about where he came from. The room fell silent. Nobody saw Snoop anymore. They saw someone who could easily blend in with any city's homeless population. Before leaving the studio, he spent time getting used to his new self. He had to remember not to fall back into old habits, no familiar gestures, no automatic responses. Every movement, every word had to come from this new identity. The success of the whole experiment depended on nobody recognizing him, not even for a second. The sun hadn't yet risen when Snoop began his journey into the streets of Los Angeles. His team had mapped out several locations across the city where he would spend time throughout the day. They'd chosen spots carefully, some in busy areas, others in quieter neighborhoods, places where homeless people often gathered, but also where police regularly patrolled. Hidden cameras were already in place, disguised as ordinary objects: a broken-down car with tinted windows, a construction worker's equipment bag, even a fake maintenance box on a telephone pole. Each one was positioned to capture natural interactions without being obvious. Snoop's security team, dressed as ordinary people, took up their positions too. A jogger here, someone reading a newspaper there, a delivery person arranging packages in their truck. As Snoop walked to his first location, he felt strange. Even though he'd grown up in these streets, this was different. People walked past him without a second glance. No one pulled out their phones for pictures. No one asked for autographs. He was invisible, just like thousands of other homeless people in the city. He settled down near a busy bus stop, placing a worn backpack beside him. This spot had been chosen because it was a regular patrol area for police. His team had studied the patterns. Officers usually passed through here every couple of hours. While he waited, Snoop started to notice things he never paid attention to before. A lady working at the coffee shop across the street would secretly leave cups of water near homeless people when her manager wasn't looking. An old man walking his dog carried extra sandwiches in his pocket, quietly handing them out along his route. These small acts of kindness weren't staged, they were real moments happening every day that most people never noticed. But there were other moments too. He watched as people crossed the street to avoid walking near homeless individuals. He saw how some shop owners immediately came out to shoo away anyone who sat too close to their stores. It was like watching two different worlds exist in the same space, but never really touching. Around midday, Snoop moved to his second location, a small park near a busy intersection. His security team shifted positions too, always keeping him in sight, but never making it obvious they were watching. Here, he sat on a bench, occasionally talking to himself like he'd seen many homeless people do. It wasn't acting anymore. He was starting to understand why someone might talk to themselves after hours of being treated like they were invisible. The most challenging part was maintaining his character when police cars drove by. Every time he saw those familiar black and white vehicles, his heart beat a little faster. Not from fear of being recognized, but from knowing these moments were what the whole experiment was about. He had to react naturally, like someone who'd been living on the streets would react. As the afternoon wore on, Snoop moved to his final location for the day, a quiet street corner near some local businesses. His team had chosen this spot because it was known for having a mix of different police officers patrolling the area. Some were known for being helpful, others for being strict. It would give them a variety of interactions to document. Between each location, Snoop would walk slowly, dragging his feet slightly like his movement coach had taught him. He carried everything he owned in that one backpack, just like real homeless people had to do. The weight of the bag started to wear on him, making his practiced posture feel more natural as the day went on. Throughout the day, his team communicated through subtle signals. A delivery person would adjust their cap if they spotted police approaching. A woman walking her dog would stop to make a phone call if she noticed any potential problems. It was like a silent dance, everyone playing their part to keep Snoop safe while letting the experiment unfold naturally. The most surprising part of the day wasn't the police interactions, it was how exhausting it was to be ignored. Snoop had spent years being the center of attention wherever he went. Now he felt the mental toll of being treated like he didn't exist. He understood better why many homeless people seemed to retreat into their own world. Sometimes, talking to yourself was better than facing a world that refused to acknowledge you were there. The first real police interaction happened around mid-morning. Snoop had been sitting on his piece of cardboard for about 2 hours when a patrol car pulled up slowly beside the curb. His heart started beating faster, but he remembered his training: stay calm, stay in character. The hidden cameras were rolling, capturing every moment. A young officer stepped out of the car, and something about his approach immediately caught Snoop's attention. Instead of coming straight at him, the officer stopped a few feet away and spoke in a gentle voice. "Hey there, sir. Pretty cold morning, isn't it?" The officer's body language was open, his hands visible, nothing threatening about his presence. Snoop mumbled a response, keeping his head down like he'd practiced. But the officer didn't walk away. Instead, he reached into his patrol car and pulled out a paper bag. "The coffee shop down the street gives us their leftover pastries. Would you like some?" It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it, like he was talking to any other person, not looking down on someone who needed help. They ended up talking for almost 15 minutes. The officer shared stories about his own uncle who had struggled with homelessness after coming back from overseas. He talked about the local shelters, which ones had the best programs, which ones still had beds available. All while keeping a respectful distance, never pushing or demanding anything. Later that afternoon, another police car stopped. This time, 2 officers approached him. Their style was different, more businesslike, but still professional. They asked for his name, where he was from, standard questions. Snoop gave them the backstory he prepared, watching their reactions carefully. One officer took notes while the other radioed in to check for warrants. Standard procedure, but done with basic respect. The most interesting encounter came when an older officer stopped by. You could tell he'd been on the job for years just by how he carried himself. He didn't ask many questions at first. Instead, he sat down on a nearby bench, keeping some distance but staying at eye level. Been out here long?" he asked, his voice carrying years of experience talking to people on the streets. Snoop told him a bit of his made-up story, and the officer just listened. Then he started sharing information, not demands or warnings, but useful stuff. Where to find free meals, which shelters had medical care, which social workers could really help. He even mentioned a job program that helped people get back on their feet. But not all interactions were positive. Some officers just drove by slowly, watching but not engaging. Others would shine their lights at night, a clear message to move along without saying a word. One pair of officers approached with hands near their weapons, their tone immediately confrontational. These moments were just as important to document the contrast between different approaches to the same situation. The most touching moment came late in the afternoon. A community officer stopped by with water bottles and some information about local resources. But instead of just dropping them off, she asked if it was okay to sit and talk for a while. She shared stories about other people she'd helped get off the streets, not in a bragging way, but with genuine care about what happened to them. Throughout the day, Snoop noticed how different officers had different effects on the homeless people around him. Some approaches made people shrink away and disappear into doorways. Others brought people out, willing to talk and accept help. It wasn't just about what services were offered, it was about how people were treated, whether they felt seen as human beings or just as problems to be solved. As the sun started to set, Snoop realized something important. The best officers weren't just enforcing laws, they were building bridges. They remembered names, followed up on promises, and treated everyone with basic human dignity. These weren't just interactions, they were relationships being built or broken, trust being earned or lost, one conversation at a time. The real test of Snoop's experiment came in an unexpected way. He had moved to a more upscale neighborhood, sitting quietly on a bench near some expensive shops. The hidden cameras were in place, one in a parked car across the street, another disguised as a store security camera. His security team was scattered around, playing their roles perfectly as everyday people going about their business. It started when a shop owner called the police. Snoop could hear the conversation through the open door, something about a suspicious person loitering near their high-end boutique. Within minutes, 2 rookie officers pulled up in their patrol car, lights flashing. These weren't the experienced officers from earlier. Their approach was different, more aggressive, less patient. "Let me see some ID," the first officer demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. His hand rested near his belt, his stance rigid and authoritative. The second officer stood slightly behind, scanning the area with suspicious eyes. Snoop kept his movements slow and deliberate, just like he'd practiced. "I lost my ID a while back," he said softly, using the rougher voice he'd perfected. The situation quickly grew tense. The officers didn't like his answer about the ID. They started firing questions rapidly. Where was he from? Why was he in this neighborhood? Did he have any weapons? Any drugs? Each question came with a more demanding tone. Snoop could feel his heart racing, but he stayed in character, answering calmly but standing his ground about his rights. Just when things seemed about to escalate, an older police car pulled up. Out stepped a senior officer, his movements unhurried but purposeful. He'd probably seen the patrol car's lights from down the street and decided to check things out. The difference in his approach was immediate and obvious. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying authority. The rookie officers straightened up, clearly recognizing their superior. The senior officer took in the scene with experienced eyes, noting Snoop's calm demeanor despite the tense situation. What happened next became the most powerful moment of the entire experiment. The senior officer gently took control, showing his younger colleagues a masterclass in human interaction. "Sir," he addressed Snoop, "mind if we start over?" His tone was professional but kind, creating a completely different atmosphere. He explained to the rookie officers, loud enough for the hidden cameras to pick up, "Look at his body language. He's not threatening anyone. He's just sitting here, keeping to himself." The senior officer went on to demonstrate proper community policing, how to ask questions respectfully, how to show concern for someone's well-being while still doing their job. The whole interaction became a teaching moment. The senior officer shared stories from his 20 years on the force, times when taking a moment to listen had turned potential confrontations into opportunities to help. He talked about knowing the difference between a security threat and someone who just needed assistance. The rookie officers' attitudes slowly changed. Their postures relaxed, their hands moved away from their belts. They started listening more, talking less. The senior officer showed them how to share information about local shelters and services without being condescending. He demonstrated how to maintain authority while showing respect. Before they left, the senior officer did something unexpected. He handed Snoop a card with contact information for local housing assistance and job training programs. "When you're ready," he said simply, not pushing, just offering. The rookie officers watched and learned. This was how you built trust in a community. As the police cars drove away, Snoop sat quietly, processing what had just happened. His security team, still maintaining their cover, had captured everything. This wasn't just about good cops versus bad cops. It was about experience, training, and most importantly, the approach. One officer had turned what could have been an ugly incident into a powerful lesson about human dignity and professional police work. A week after his street experience, Snoop organized a special community meeting at a local community center. The room was packed. Police officers, community leaders, social workers, and even some of the homeless people he'd met during his experiment. Nobody knew exactly why they were there. The only information they'd received was that it was about improving police and community relations. The lights dimmed and a projector flickered to life. The first image showed a homeless man sitting on a bench, nothing special, just another person on the streets. Then came the transformation video. People gasped as they watched Snoop Dogg disappear under makeup and prosthetics, becoming the same homeless man they'd just seen. You could hear whispers spreading through the room as realization dawned. Snoop stood up from his seat in the back, walking to the front of the room. The audience fell silent. He didn't start with a big speech or accusations. Instead, he played the first clip, the young officer who shared his pastries and talked about his uncle. The officer was in the room, and all eyes turned to him. His face showed surprise, then understanding, as he watched himself on screen. "This right here," Snoop said, pointing to the footage, "this is what makes a difference." His voice was gentle but firm. He wasn't there to shame anyone. He was there to show what worked, what didn't, and why it mattered. The footage continued, showing different interactions throughout his days on the street. When they reached the clip of the senior officer teaching the rookies, the room got even quieter. The senior officer was there too, sitting near the front. He watched himself on screen, nodding slowly as Snoop explained how that moment had changed the entire experiment. "This wasn't just about police training," Snoop said. "This was about human beings connecting with other human beings." But Snoop didn't just show the positive moments. He showed the drive-by patrols, the suspicious glances, the confrontational approaches. He explained how each style of interaction made him feel, not as Snoop Dogg the celebrity, but as someone society often chooses not to see. The most powerful moment came when he invited some of the homeless people he'd met to speak. They shared their own stories, not tales of blame or anger, but honest accounts of their daily interactions with law enforcement. Some officers in the room recognized themselves in these stories, both in good ways and bad. One clip showed how different officers approached the same situation in different ways. Side by side, the contrast was clear. When an officer approached with respect and compassion, people opened up, shared information, accepted help. When they came in with aggression or suspicion, people shut down, ran away, or got defensive. Halfway through the presentation, something amazing happened. Officers started raising their hands, sharing their own experiences. They talked about the challenges they faced, the training they received, and what they wished the public understood about their job. The homeless community members listened, really listened, and shared their perspectives too. The meeting wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about building bridges. Snoop showed how small changes in approach could make huge differences in results. He highlighted officers who were already doing it right, making them examples for others to follow. The footage proved that good policing wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about understanding the human beings they were sworn to protect and serve. As the lights came back on, there wasn't the usual rush to leave. People stayed, talking in small groups. Officers were exchanging contact information with community leaders. Social workers were connecting with police departments to set up better communication channels. Real relationships were being formed right there in that room. The reveal wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Snoop had done more than just expose problems. He created a space where solutions could be found, where both sides could see each other as people first, where real change could start to happen. This wasn't just another celebrity stunt. This was community building in action. 6 months after Snoop's social experiment, the changes in the community were real and visible. What started as a one-day experiment had grown into something much bigger. The local police department had completely changed their approach to working with homeless people, and other cities were starting to take notice. The footage from Snoop's experiment became a key part of police training programs. New officers watched these videos during their training, learning from both the good and bad examples. But it wasn't just about watching videos. The department had created new guidelines based on what they'd learned. Officers who showed exceptional compassion in their work became mentors to younger officers. Snoop's foundation partnered with the police department to create a new program called Street Connect. The idea was simple but powerful. Every week, officers would pair up with social workers to visit homeless communities. They wouldn't go to make arrests or move people along. They'd go to build relationships, offer help, and really listen to what people needed. One of the rookie officers from the experiment had completely transformed his approach. Now he was leading workshops for other officers, sharing what he'd learned that day. "I thought I was doing my job right," he'd tell them, "until I saw myself through someone else's eyes." His honest words hit home with other officers, making them think about their own approaches. The senior officer who had turned the tense situation around became a key figure in the department's new training program. He worked with Snoop's team to develop guidelines for approaching homeless people with dignity and respect. His experience proved that good policing and compassion could go hand in hand. Local businesses started changing too. The coffee shop owner who had called the police on Snoop now worked with the department's outreach program. Instead of seeing homeless people as problems to be removed, they started seeing them as community members who needed support. More businesses joined in, offering job training programs and employment opportunities. The impact spread beyond just the police department. Local shelters reported that more people were willing to come in for help because they trusted the officers who referred them. Social workers found it easier to connect with people on the streets because the police were now seen as partners in helping, not just enforcement. Snoop didn't just walk away after the experiment. He stayed involved, checking in regularly with both the police department and the homeless community. His foundation set up a special fund to help people get back on their feet, not just with temporary solutions, but with real paths to stable housing and jobs. The most powerful change was in the stories people shared. Homeless individuals reported feeling more seen, more heard, more respected. Officers talked about feeling more fulfilled in their work, knowing they were making a real difference. The us versus them mentality was slowly breaking down, replaced by a sense of shared community. One day, about 8 months after the experiment, Snoop visited a local shelter. He saw a familiar face, one of the people he'd met during his time on the streets. The person was now working at the shelter, helping others find their way to better lives. "Your experiment," they told him, "it didn't just change how police treat us. It changed how we see ourselves." The media coverage of the experiment's results brought attention from other cities. Police departments from across the country started sending officers to learn from what was happening here. Snoop's experiment wasn't just changing one community, it was starting a movement. As Snoop sat in his studio a year later, looking at photos from the experiment, he realized something important. The biggest change wasn't in the policies or programs, it was in how people saw each other. The experiment had reminded everyone that behind every uniform and every cardboard sign was a human being deserving of dignity and respect.